Did you think that all of a sudden Ingold made better sense after you read this? That was surprising, I thought. Came together. That the land is not just a backdrop for our things, the nature, the landscape stuff. Anyway, very nice work. We traced back to, let's see, so there's some really good stuff in Bonilla on around pages 142, 143, 144, and 5. I guess I would say 141 through 145 for now. About, you know, nature, well, the section nature as an archive of traces. And you sometimes have to remember that the way Ingold uses nature, we're not going to inflict that onto Bonilla. I think they're both basically on the same page if the terms don't always match up. Anyway, from 141 through 145. And you took us directly back to the things in Ingold that I started thinking about. I was reading this back in chapter 8 on the idea of memory and the activeness, the activity of memory. So that's on 147 and 148 of Ingold. And then on the landscape, around page 208, which was, if we remember that landscape chapter, nobody liked it when we read it because it was so confusing, but here it was. It suddenly comes back to life. Congealed history, all that good stuff helps us know what's going on. So this was a nice surprise to find out that these things can be related to each other. And that'd be a great essay topic. In fact, we've already basically written it. Second surprise. For those of us who've been reading Ingold up till now, and we've been talking about hunting and gathering, and there's all these geese and bear running around, and, you know, ecology, and out in the woods and the Arctic. All of a sudden, somebody's using a buzzsaw, somebody's doing a grindstone, people are doing these big hammers, these giant hammers come crashing down. Karl Marx is walking around saying stuff. It's like, what happened to my, what happened to the nature Ingold? For those of you who might be confused by this chapter, worry not. I think Ingold is going to give us another chance to do technology in the chapter 16. So I actually think this may not be his best version of technology. We'll get a chance to basically go over it again in the next chapter and in the next class. The reason I still like this chapter is in part because it's so confusing, and it's got so much stuff in it, and you don't know where you are, and it's very disorienting. And that's not probably a reason to like something. Late last night, I did ponder sending you another email that said, don't worry, don't worry if you're confused, just plow on through, just machine read it. But I think, you know, we did all right. So we'll get another chance. Like I said, I think in part this is because Ingold is deliberetely showing us how difficult it is to define some of these terms and how much people have wrestled with it. I mean, this is like an abbreviation of how much a number of guys have tackled this. And when I say guys, I do actually mean there's a very gendered nature to this chapter, which we should at least have in the back of our heads. So, technology. So in the modern, in our Western world of the idea about technology, I would say basically boils down to we got it and they don't. I mean, that we live in a technological society and that when you go to other places, they don't have the same level of technology. So you'll always hear people talking about this. I mean, I guess I would say when you go to societies that are outside of the capitalist orbit. These days, if you go to places like Japan, you're liable to be surprised in a different direction, or South Korea, and they marvel at our lack of internet broadband and all kinds of things that we apparently don't have. But I guess, you know, in the old days, this would be the way that people would travel to other countries and basically believe that we had technology and they didn't. And there's an idea that technology kind of is in a sphere of its own, and it progresses from the simple, you know, you're using one technology and then you get more and more complicated. And that still is very much part of our lives, this idea that every, you know, iPhone 3 and then you have to buy iPhone 4 and it's always getting more and more better and complicated, and that's the way technology proceeds. And so for the basic Western idea is one that Ingold terms, or that other people have called technological determinism. That you know, society, our social relationships are determined by our level of technology, or as Heilbronner put it in a famous article from 1967, do machines make history? Question mark. But this is, many people in the West would say, yes, machines are the source of history, or technology is the source of history. The problem, the idea of technological determinism. Now, one thing that immediately gets a little bit muddy here is, usually I've been saying the mainstream Western view to characterize something in Ingold that has kind of deep roots in the West. But in this case, it's a very modern or contemporary view. This view is probably at most, you know, 200 or 300 years old. Ingold specifies figures such as Galileo, Newton, and Descartes, but you would probably even go up to what we call the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And the reason I'm sort of highlighting or underlining the word modern here is because the etymological source, according to Ingold, of the word technology, there's two classical Greek words, techne, which meant the kind of art or skill that we associate with craftsmanship. So originally, techne just basically meant artisanry or crafts, being a craftsperson. And then there was logos, which means framework of principles derived from the application of reason. Oh, that's where we get things like biology and anthropology, you know, the study of or applying reason to these things. And Ingold says that they wouldn't combine those two words. Occasionally they would, to denote the art of reason or the skill involved in rhetorical debate. So it had very little to do, if they ever combined techne and logos together, it would have very little to do with what we think of as technology, and in some ways was the opposite of what we think of as technology. So this is a fairly modern idea that what technology is the application of knowledge in service or to machines. Ingold talks here about another kind of contemporary transformation, the separation between design and execution. So on page 295, originally an architect is the builder, a master builder. But in today's world, there's a separation between the architect, who's like the person who does all the designing and the drawing and the comes up with the idea, and the builder or the contractor, the building industry, whose job it is to simply implement the idea. So as Ingold puts it, the architect designs the house, the builder implements the architect's design. One creates but does not implement, the other implements but does not create. And so this, again, is a pretty modern idea of a separation that the Greeks and others probably throughout the early modern period or the Middle Ages of Europe would not have understood at all, because this was seen as an artisanal unity. So that's the modern Western view. We now counterpose that with the view that we get from anthropology. Now, fortunately, you both took Intro to Anthropology with Dr. Sugandhi, so I wasn't there for that. You might, though, think about that chapter that you read in her textbook on technology. I think she uses the essentials of anthropology. Do you remember that textbook chapter on technology in there? But you both took cultural anthropology with me, and we read a cultural anthropology textbook. What did the chapter on technology say?
Cyborgs.
There were some cyborgs in there. Where did those cyborgs come in, though?
Oh, it was not transcendental. That's the opposite of cyborg.
Post-humanism. I have to look up those cyborgs. I forgot about the cyborgs. I'm going to have to look up where those were. This was supposed to be a trick question. You're supposed to shake your head at me and say, what are you talking about? I mean, there is no technology chapter. I think the cyborgs, I have to go back and look at it. I think they might have come up in the kinship chapter. Is there one?
I think there was a weird chapter about boundaries, which also.
The boundaries. Oh yeah. That was a strange textbook that I used.
It was my reflection question for you, because I asked how much of yourself would you automatically.
Oh, right. How much are you willing to give? How much of yourself would you replace with technology? See, you were onto this, you know. Did I say everything? I think I did. I think I said all. As you can see. I mean, in general, though, that's very good. We should look back at that. In general, anthropology has very little to say about technology, right? We have almost nothing to say. If we have anything to say, well, what would you say as an anthropologist if somebody came and they came back from a trip that they took to, I don't know. They were on the South Africa J-term and they're like, I couldn't believe it. They're still using digging sticks there. Oh my gosh. What are you supposed to say?
That technology isn't like a linear progression, and it doesn't mean that one person's more advanced than the other.
It doesn't mean that one person's more advanced than the other. Even if we might say that technology is a linear progression, what we're going to do is we're going to say just because somebody's using simple tools doesn't mean their culture is simple, doesn't mean their minds are simple, you know, that they'll, you know, we could bring in a tractor and they could get to used to that, but it's not, it's not because of their minds are simple. And in fact, there's the movie that I showed you on, the film that I showed you on Rabbit Proof Fence. There's a great line in there where he finds out that they're on the fence, and he starts looking at it on the map, and he says, just because they use Neolithic tools doesn't mean they have Neolithic minds. So there's this idea that, the mind is separate from the tool. And, even in places like Australia, just because they're using stone tools, they could equally be as smart as any of us. And so for anthropologists, technology is actually something that we would say is that we all have. So this is on page 294. I think anthropology would want to say, we imagine that where tools are being used, there must exist a technology. I mean, and so we would say, I would say, hey, those people are using tools or digging sticks or whatever. So, they have a technical idea as well. It's what, and wow, they were able to domesticate plants or domesticate animals that you wouldn't even know about, you Eurocentric jerk. So we would, say this is what belongs to all of humanity. We all have it. Oh, there's one of the authors that gets thrown in here. The problem with this, it's kind of like, if everybody has culture, but it's even perhaps worse than that, which is that if everyone has technology, then what separates technology from just living and working with things? Or as the bottom of page 297 asks, is there anything the skeptic might ask about human life and activity that is not technological, right? So if every time we're using a tool, all of a sudden we have technology, then what is the use of even having a term for it? What is special about technology? If not, what need have we for the concept of technology at all? Beyond stating the obvious, how does it help us to know that everything is technological? So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem, as you start to encounter as you read through this, is that the definition of technology has been incredibly difficult to define. It's been incredibly difficult to figure out its relationship to science. Well, as Ingold put it, a cursory review, a brief review of the literature in the history and philosophy of technology reveals a plethora of approaches to the definition of its subject matter, not unlike that in anthropology surrounding the definitions of culture. Both disciplines have faced an uphill task in their search for a concept which is sort of bigger than one society, could be applied, but how big should it be? Basically, what is technology anyway? Ingold then takes up this Mitchum thing where he's going to do technology as objects, technology as process, technology as knowledge, and technology as volition, linking them together in the form of a diagram. I find this a helpful place from which to start, says Ingold. And I say, really? Because that sounds really difficult to start. I actually would like to concentrate on one part of this, which I think kind of gets at some of the issues, which is the distinction between what is a tool and what is a machine. And certainly this seems to be, common sense is like, okay, if I have a drill that I'm doing like this, then that's a tool. But if I have a power drill, then that must be some machine. Or if I can press a button and it drills for me, then I have a machine. So there's a sort of common sense definition. But if you kind of keep after it, like how, all these authors come up with different ideas for, does it have an independent source of power? Is it guided by the hand or not? Or and so Marx is there and Leroy Gourhan is there. And they had come up with these different ideas for what marks the transition point between a tool and a machine. Ingold says that, and of course we've seen this claim before made about domesticated plants and wild plants, but it's interesting to be applied here to tools and machines. This is on page 303. Thus, with regard to both motive power and working parts, the difference between tools and machines is one of degree rather than kind. So it's not necessarily a firm line, because there can be some things which are externally powered but need the hand to guide them. And there are other things in which the hand simply provides the power or the force behind it. But the machine is a sort of, in some ways, guiding itself. So again, there's not this firm line. And I find also quite interesting all those different examples in which the human and the machine are basically together, or the human is part of the machine and providing, in some cases, the power and the guidance of the tool. I guess maybe an example, a picture might help. So we have, this is kind of like the Treadle Grindstone on page 305. I probably should figure out who this guy is and give him some credit, but he's working that grindstone with this foot, and that's being able to turn the things. That's provided you're giving the machine its power through your feet, your rotating motion. And Ingold mentions the potter's wheel as another example of this, but then you're doing skilled stuff with your hands there. So and then the human actually is integrated with the machine. Like I said, I think that gender, we should, there's a lot of man here, and I'm not saying men can't run sewing machines, but every time I look for a picture of a sewing machine, well, then there'd be women there. Very similar, though. We have a woman, we have a person who can power this machine with their feet, but do the guiding with the hands at the top. And so this is a classic, a vintage sewing machine. Don't even have to plug it in. Well, you're smiling. Why?
My grandmother had that, but then once she didn't, she just took the sewing part, like the top part out and used it as a table.
She just took that thing off. Did she have another one, or she just got tired of it?
She just started using that as her sewing table.
They're beautiful things. They're beautiful antiques. Yeah, they can be used as tables. Yeah, no, people collect these things. Actually, one of my wife's colleagues restores old sewing machines, but he restores the power kind. So I actually have a powered one of these that I gave to my daughter somewhere. She didn't get too into it, but it was fun for a while. But yeah, I mean, eventually some of these got hooked up to electricity, of course, and you didn't have to. Maybe do you still do something with your feet? No, then the power just comes in and you use your hands, and you just try to keep your hands from getting sewn together as the thing's just buzzing along. This might be better. So she stopped using it. Does she get the electric? Did I ask you that? Does she get the powered one? This became the table. They were nice. Good stuff. Yeah, so in any case, we have these examples in which humans and machines, or humans are the machine in some ways. I was also interested in Actually, I think, Willa, you were interested in this part too, with the non-human animals, and to what degree horsepower, for example, becomes part of the machine. And a lot of the mills and things that we have, maybe in, well, I don't know. You do any mills there in Pennsylvania? Or is that more of a New England thing? Like on the rivers?
I'm from Milford.
You're from Milford, aha! There. So named because of the mills?
I think we have a mill.
You think? Yeah, so I mean, a lot of these things were set up along waterways, so the waterways could turn gears and provide the power. But in other places, there's a great picture on page 307 where you have these horses hooked up to something. And this was, I don't think I took this picture, but I was in the museum of the Potussie Mint in Bolivia for a J-term adventure. And the Potosí Mint, as I think I've told you, is the place where we got half of the world's silver. And there's this interesting place where they're making the silver into bars and into coins, where the basement is the horses basically made to walk around this room, like you see there. But then that turns the gears in the top layer so they could, make this silver and press various designs onto it. And I mean, it does occur to me that if you were in the top part, you might not have much idea what was pushing or making. The wheels would have seemed as if they were moving by themselves. You wouldn't know if they were plugged into something, or there were humans down there pushing them, or a river. I mean, you probably did know, but in some ways it was walled off so that the horses could provide the motive power force for this enormous machine. These wheels were actually brought over in pieces from Spain and then installed in this place. And then, according to the guide, the horses were actually worth more than the people working the mines in terms of their life expectancy. But they were nevertheless not in the best conditions at all. So there's some really interesting passages in here about, when people wanted to use horses, and the idea that the horses are like machines, or that animals are like machines. And as Ingold says on page 308, if the beasts really were machines, as Cartesian philosophy would have us believe, converting oats into tractive effort, it would not be necessary to shield them from extraneous sensory inputs by covering their eyes with blinkers. As Marx, after all, the difference between the horse and the locomotive is that, barring mechanical failure, locomotives do not bolt, take fright, or simply decide to stop. As Marx shrewdly notes, the great disadvantage of horses as a motive force for industry, quite apart from the high costs of maintenance, lies in the fact that, quote, a horse has a head of its own. So we often have used animals and tried to believe that they are machines, but in fact, it often means applying pain and compelling them to do these kinds of things. Ingold also here mentions the role. He is again mainly talking about ancient slavery, enslavement of peoples, but there, in some ways, what happened in the Americas was a massive importation of Africans, mainly to cut sugarcane, and in some ways to attempt to homogenize the labor force and make it into a kind of machine that could cut across all these places, and there was a lot of calculations done about how much labor you could extract, and apparently in some places the average life of a sugarcane cutter was placed at about 7 years, and so people would try to get 7 years of work done. And so there's this idea that you could homogenize the labor force and to make sure that the cane was being cut. And as Sidney Mintz has argued, much of the ways in which sugar cane was cut and then boiled and made into sugar would become a kind of template for the industrial factory later in Europe. And so again, this homogenization of workers, the kind of idea that people were replaceable in a factory-like setting. But what is also interesting here, and I went back and looked at in relationship to the things that were going on in this enslavement and the idea of machines. And I was looking at Michel Rolf Trouillot's work on what he called the striker. And interestingly, in these plantations, you'd have these, the cutting of cane, and it had to be converted to sugar in a very precise process. And so what Trouillot says is that there was the striker, the one who helped decide when the boiling of the cane juices had reached the exact point when they could be transferred from one vessel to the next. Some planters tried to identify that moment by using complex thermometers. So the idea was you had this sugar cane, you're starting to boil it, you're moving it, maybe we can just do this with a thermometer. Yet, since the right moment depended on temperature, on the intensity of the fire, on the viscosity of the juice, and on the quality of the original cane itself and its state at the time of cutting, other planters thought that a good striker was much more valuable than the most complex technology. So you have here, on the one hand, this attempt by the precursors of capitalist industry to make sugar according to machines and technology, and basically do that through enslaved people that are replaceable and homogenizable. But you have the emergence also of these specifically skilled people who are able to do this amazing task, and thus would get, in some cases, money for it. Even though they were enslaved, or would be more valuable than the technological implements that they would have. I mention that because we then take us to the end where Ingold returns to his original question of do machines make history, which is Heilbronner's question from 1967. And if we are a part of the machine, do we then become living appendages of machines? I'm thinking about if we could combine our GPSs to the self-driving car, and I can just step into this and say, take me to, where do you want to go? Oh, I could go to one of your towns. Take me to York. And it would go. I wouldn't have to worry about anything. And then I would just be able to sit there. I could be an appendage of the machine. Ingold says that no, we can't become, this is on page 3, we can't, not quite. For it is a fact the best constructed system of automatic machinofacture, even if provided with a continuous supply of fuel and raw materials, would soon grind to a standstill without human attention. So even if we have the self-driving car, there's going to need to be somebody to fix the self-driving car and somebody to fix the computers and all those things. What happened with your computer, Gabe? Did you ever get it fixed?
No.
Too hard to fix. But if you got it fixed, you would have needed like many expert people working on the machine. So this is what happens when we, you know, when we have machines, they require people to fix the machines and to keep working on them. And so at the very end, on page 311, Ingold says, do machines make history? The answer must surely be that they do not. They don't, and then he goes into, you know, a possible misreading of Marx that may have prompted such an idea, but he concludes that in fact what it is that machines have been made by history, but, and this is a sentence that has always confused me, machines have not so much been made as been made by history, one in which human beings to an ever increasing extent have become the authors of their own dehumanization. I guess that's me when I'm driving along in the car and just doing whatever the machine tells me to do. I don't even bother to look around very much, except not to crash into people and things. I've become the author of my own dehumanization by just let the machine tell me what to do. But the machine is not actually controlling my life, being destiny. We've become the authors of our own dehumanization. It doesn't sound like something he would say.
I don't know, because normally he's like, no, we aren't separate from the world, blah, blah. Parts of the world.
Well, I think he's, well, he's, yes, it is something he would say, in that he is saying that we we in Western societies have basically been doing this to ourselves. We've become the authors of our own dehumanization. And that's why he's trying to write this whole book, to get us back into things, get us back the way we should be. Get out of that car and get into life. Start walking. Do more walking. Gabe. Huh?
Well, they aren't human because other animals use tools, but it's a part of our humanity. Oh
yeah, no, Ingold's way into that. He's way into tool use and artisan, and he just wants you to be, you know, he just wants you to not only think about the design, but actually go out there and do it. He doesn't want you just sitting there with your architecture thing and drawing stuff and letting somebody else do it. You need to go out there and start using some hammers and treadles and walking around. Absolutely. Don't let them dehumanize you, but you certainly should be using tools, and you should be using machines too, as often as possible. But because machines aren't making history, we are. We're making the machines. But don't let them rule your life, and don't think your life is ruled by them. Yeah, you know, this is going to be, this section of it, this last section of Ingold is going to be tricky. We'll get another swipe at it in a bit. The other reason I was surprised by this, well, in this section of Ingold, I showed you this a long time ago in Cultural Anthropology, about in a long sentence of something that I almost made you read and then pulled back from. In this section of Ingold, one of my main objectives is to investigate the idea of teleology, or we might say that history, our own destiny, has been predetermined to get to an end point. And so when we say technological determination, that is actually determinism, that's actually a teleological idea that technology is ever becoming more complex, and that our history is destined out because we are in fact governed by the machines that are making history. Now, the way that Triot put it was that teleology replaces eschatology. That is to say, in the old days, and by old days I mean really old days, Middle Ages and that time, eschatology is the idea of the end times, or the interpretation of the book of Revelations and the times in which the world draws to an end. And so the idea in the Christian framework is that the world is being brought to a purpose by the workings of God. And I think Jesus is going to come back. There might be a rapture in there. Things are going to happen in the end times. Are we there yet? Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I was raised in a world steeped in eschatology, and basically was told, though, that the world has been coming to an end since about 1988, which was 40 years after the foundation of Israel or something like that. And people said there would be only one generation. They found a scripture to support that. So 1988 came and went, and I'm still here, still going along. And yes, but Jesus said, I think, that you will hear of wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes in diverse places. I don't know. It does seem kind of end-timey, doesn't it? Doesn't seem like we're here. And no, you haven't seen any horsemen on the apocalypse. I don't know. Anyway, okay, back to life. So the idea is that teleology basically becomes what eschatology used to be. So that instead of being ruled by a divine order, we're being ruled by technology or the market, or by the triumph of the nation state. Now, I was originally afraid, by pairing these chapters together, especially since I had reworked the syllabus a little bit and shuffle things around, that I'd be completely out of step here with what Bonilla is doing. But if you look on page 136 of Bonilla, there's this telos and teleology stuff in there. So some people, authors such as Derek Walcott and Orlando Patterson, have at times suggested that trauma of slavery has led to a kind of New World historical amnesia. The idea is that you know, and those are that there's not history because that it's been erased and forgotten because of the trauma of enslavement. Edward Glissant shared this preoccupation, but he argued that it was not a question of collective amnesia. Glissant argues that in the Antilles, the past is, quote, obsessively present, but it constitutes a form of non-history in the sense that it lacks the organizing telos, the arc, and triumphant narratives of Western history, resulting in a fractured and disorganized form of historicity. So the idea is that history is, or Glissant is saying that there's a lot of stuff, that the past is very much there, obsessively present, but since it can't be organized into this narrative of that was the past and everything happens for a reason, and now we've become a triumphant nation state, it gets disorganized, or it's not, it can't be put together. And so again, some very interesting parallels here across Triot, Ingold, Bonilla, to be able to, in these memory walks, And in this sort of feeling of the past, of bringing history together, well, you did a great job sort of condensing these ideas, is on page, as you put, page 145. The past, what happens after the memory walk, the past is ordered, not through a chronology of events. And nice that now maybe that part where Ingold objects to those chronological times, but through a thematic spiral that spins through the past, present, and future of a shared space. And so at the end of this root of history chapter, they're able to shape the past, bring it into the present, and then, as Glissant said, they would be able to calmly take us into tomorrow. And so I guess I would slightly adjust what I think she's saying. I don't think she's saying that they have made a new triumphant telos or a new triumphant teleology, but what it does is it gives them certainty about the past, in turn fuels their hope in the possibility of a new collective future. So they don't know what that future is going to be. It's not like it's already written for them, but they're able to do something and to be more confident about the actions that they take, that they can become the authors of their own history. They can humanize the process that is happening around them. Just like what I told you to do, use those tools and be architects and build things. You don't have to be afraid of those things. You just have to humanize them. The possibility of a new collective future.